Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, August 30th, 2024. This week's Chairman's Report is guest written by Randy Fischer, an AFFT Vice President and Board Member. We get less of what we tax. Art Laffer, a prominent American economist, developed a bell-curved analysis that showed the relationship between income tax rates and the total tax revenue the Treasury receives. The Laffer curve sought to identify the tax rate that maximizes revenue for the government. In the process, it showed conclusively that higher rates often mean less revenue. For example, a tax rate of 100% would result in very little revenue because nobody's going to work if the government's going to take every penny they make. The Laffer curve influenced then-President Ronald Reagan, who led a charge in the 1980s that resulted in one of the biggest tax cuts in history. Despite the supposed mathematical reality that lower income tax rates will result in less money coming into the Treasury, all else being equal, the number of dollars flowing into the Treasury actually increased dramatically during Reagan's time in office. In 1980, total federal tax revenue was $517 billion. Under President Reagan's supply-side economic theory, that nearly doubled to $909 billion by 1988. The behavioral and economic impact of lowering income tax rates from a stimulus perspective, despite how logical it sounds to us now, it wasn't really researched or considered until Art Laffer did it in the early 1970s. We have the empirical data now. We also have an instinctive understanding that the more we tax something, the less of it we get. So, why is it that in every congressional and presidential election cycle, we hear certain politicians harping on the need to tax us more? Well, let's take it one step further and discuss the entire system of taxation. Let's compare our current system of taxing income versus the fair tax, a tax on consumption. If we can collectively agree that we all desire a productive country, a society where people can advance, do bigger and better things, and as a result earn more income, then why would we ever tax income at all? People generally feel like they work hard for their money. They've invested a lot of blood, sweat, and valuable time away from their loved ones in order to earn the income they need to provide for themselves and their families. For most of us, working is the only way that we'll ever acquire any meaningful property of our own. Given this, is it any surprise that illegal income tax evasion has reached $1 trillion annually in the United States? We're psychologically disposed to lament and disdain taxation of our hard-earned income, and many will rationalize and justify illegal evasion on these and other grounds. Now, you might rightfully ask, but with the fair tax, when we tax consumption, won't the economy deteriorate because we get less spending due to less consumption? Well, the answer to that is no. To the contrary, the economy, by all reasonable estimates, studies, and detailed analyses, will flourish under the fair tax. The U.S. becomes the tax haven of the world with a 0% corporate income tax rate, and companies and factories rush to the U.S., driving employment to new heights and unemployment to new lows. We'll need more legal immigration than ever. Detailed analysis shows that purchasing power, real GDP, jobs, investment, wages, and even consumption by year 3 all increase with enactment of the fair tax. Individuals across the country would keep their entire paychecks under the fair tax. Demand for labor would rise to unprecedented levels, driving wages even higher. Simply put, Americans will have more money in their pockets under the fair tax. And what happens when people have more money to spend? Well, they spend it. We saw that in the 1980s when charitable donations increased despite the tax benefit associated with those contributions decreasing under a lower rate structure. The unusual phenomenon with spending and consumption is that with the fair tax, we're not taxed on what we must spend to survive because of the prebate mechanism that untaxes us on our basic necessities. Further, For two of our largest lifetime expenditures, that being homes and cars, we can legally avoid paying the fair tax since it's only collected on the retail purchase of new goods and services. The vast majority of home and auto purchases are for previously owned houses and cars. Those transactions would not be subject to the fair tax. Lastly, when we spend on a new product, it'll be our choice as to what class of product we purchase, the shiny new one with bells and whistles, or a more economical option. Taxing consumption rather than income will give us an unprecedented level of control over when we pay our taxes and how much we pay. This creates an entirely different psychological paradigm. With the fair tax, we enjoy the fruits of a burgeoning economy and spend and pay our consumption tax at our discretion, rather than having the toil of our labor confiscated from us in the form of an income tax. So, like President Reagan before us, which one should we choose? In conclusion, Randy clearly shows the benefits of the fair tax and why it's a winning strategy with the public. The choice is easy. Do we want a system for funding the government that's so simple everyone can understand it, that shows the cost of the federal government on every retail receipt so all of us can understand what we're paying, that helps U.S. companies compete with foreign competitors, that keeps jobs in the U.S. rather than exporting them to other countries, that permanently establishes the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, and is the largest transfer of power from D.C. to the people since the Constitution was adopted? Now, D.C. is ignoring the one real solution that allows us to remain citizens and not subjects, the fair tax. The fair tax is simple, it's non-invasive, but most of all, it works. The solution? Pass the fair tax. Now, why would D.C. pass the fair tax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Now, there's going to be a vote on the fair tax in the House of Representatives. We now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the president income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the fair tax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS, or they can vote to eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of their government, or they can pass the fair tax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. And finally, they can support the largest transfer of power from government to the people, the fair tax, or they can vote against it. Now, if members think the fair tax needs to be amended to address a problem, they can propose the change. Don't let them get away with rejecting the entire bill because it has a perceived flaw that can be easily addressed, and if it's a real flaw, corrected in the final bill. And don't think for an instant there aren't any flaws in the income tax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. If you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to fairtax.org to invest in AFFT and help us pass the fair tax. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.